topic is called St. Francis, Pope Francis and the 2016 election. There are many wrinkles to this whole election and many different perspectives to bring to it. I thought I would attempt to view the issues of the 2016 election through the lens of our patron St. Francis and Pope Francis and see where it leads. So I'm looking at three issues: poverty, peacemaking, and the environment, because these three are reflected in the life and teaching of St. Francis and Pope Francis. Let's see where our current candidates line up on these issues. Under poverty, I include immigration and refugees. I'll speak very little about immigration because we have another distinguished panelist who will be addressing that. Peacemaking, and in that I include civility in public discourse and interreligious dialogue. And the environment, and in that I include human life. My students realize that I am into black on white in PowerPoint. I think it's kind of creative, don't you think? So Francis of Assisi was on a kind of a downward mobility journey through at least half of his life, moving from riches to rags. Kind of the opposite of how most folks try to move in life. How did he do that? Every student here in Religious Studies 105 can answer that question, but I'll give you the shorthand version. Francis experienced a lot of trial and trauma in the first half of his life: war, injury, imprisonment, failure in business, conflict with his family, crisis of faith, and then his life began to turn. And he said, "The Lord led me in a new direction." And that began with an encounter with lepers. He entered into another world, and his eyes were opened. He began to recognize that the world didn't belong to the rich and powerful, as he had already thought, but really belonged to all people. And he learned to move beyond what today we call trickle-down wealth. That wealth doesn't just trickle down from those who have it to those who don't. That in fact, God is the originator of affirmative action, if that's not a heretical statement. But God's playing field is not level. God's playing field is tilted in the direction of the weak and the powerless. And all you have to do is read the gospel parables to recognize that. Pope Francis, especially in the Joy of the Gospel, his exhortation at the beginning of his pontificate, criticizes the growing gap between rich and poor. And he says economic injustice is threatened by ethics, because ethics makes power and money relative. And economic injustice is threatened by God, because God is totally uncontrollable. God does crazy things like freeing slaves. So you can't trust God. Then, amusingly, I think, the Pope, in response to so much pushback about his leftist leanings, says, please understand, the Pope is not a socialist. The Pope loves rich and poor alike, but feels compelled by the gospel to call the rich to the support of the poor. How about our candidates today? There are 46+ million Americans living in poverty in the United States and over 1 billion worldwide. Mr. Trump favors the trickle-down approach to economics. Hillary Clinton seeks more middle-class opportunities, more middle-class job openings. The reality is that nobody's talking about poverty. Bernie Sanders did. Bernie Sanders actually has had an influence on the Democratic platform, but the candidates are not talking about poverty. Perhaps this is a reflection of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court that puts unlimited money into political campaigns, and so candidates are inclined to support the positions of those who are paying their way. Money talks, and the poor don't vote. What about immigration and refugees under that category of poverty? Well, we know that Trump would restrict immigration, exclude refugees, deport the undocumented, and build a wall across our southern border. Hillary Clinton favors a more generous immigration policy and increased reception of Syrian refugees. proposing an increase from 20,000 this year to 65,000 next year. So where's the advantage? With regard to poverty, Clinton moderately, because as I say, neither candidate is really addressing poverty, but Hillary Clinton is a little more inclined to at least the middle class. And certainly Clinton is more substantially on board with regard to immigration and refugees. So about peacemaking. I started with a quote from Pat Conroy's book, The Lords of Discipline. Having experienced cruelty, I decided to live my life as a peaceful man. I use that as a reflection of the life of St. Francis, who experienced cruelty in warfare, in imprisonment, and decided to live his life as a peaceful man, making peace in Assisi and in church. One of the really fascinating parts of Francis' life is when the Pope called for a crusade and tried to recruit soldiers for the crusade, and offered a signing bonus to those who would join the crusade, namely a plenary indulgence. St. Francis went to the Pope and said, well, you should give the same spiritual benefit to those who make a pilgrimage for peace. Hence the Portugal indulgence. The Pope agreed and granted the same spiritual benefit to those who would make a pilgrimage for peace as those who would join the crusade. And of course, the classic encounter between Francis and the Sultan in Damietta, Egypt, was a conversion moment for Francis himself, as he discovered that the so-called enemy, the one he was taught to see as an enemy, was in fact a fellow searcher, a fellow believer, a man of faith, a man of learning. Francis himself underwent a kind of conversion experience in that dialogue. Pope Francis, in the encyclical Laudato Si, links war, poverty, and the environment, and says that war damages the environment and afflicts the poor. Actually, the actions of Pope Francis are more dramatic than his words, as for example, when he brought 3 families of Syrian refugees to live at the Vatican, when he hosted a Palestinian-Israeli peace conference, when he washed the feet of Muslim women, and on with actions that reflect this kind of peacemaking disposition. In the case of Donald Trump, it's certainly no secret that there's not much civility there, that he acts in a boorish, narcissistic, and sexist way and insults Muslims, Mexicans, the handicapped, and women. His foreign policy veers from, I love war, to I want to expand the number of nuclear-armed nations, to I would abandon our NATO allies. I call it a mix of isolationism and survivalism. Clinton called Trump's supporters deplorables and unredeemable, a breach of civility, to say the least. And yet she speaks most respectfully of minorities, foreign leaders, and religious diversity. Is Hillary Clinton a peacemaker? I think you can argue that point. She favors a more muscular foreign policy. This is the best stance in an unstable world. I'm not sure any of us has the answer. A Franciscan response certainly favors diplomacy over armed intervention. Where's the advantage here? On civility and diplomatic experience, the advantage would be with Clinton, a judgment call with regard to recourse to armed intervention. And then there's creation and human life. We know St. Francis is the patron of the environment, and I hope we recognize that he's about more than birds. We've seen lots of bird baths and lots of statues of Francis with birds, but it's really all creation for Francis that mirrors God and all people who are sisters and brothers to one another. Pope Francis borrowed the title of Francis's canonical for his encyclical, Laudato Si, and he promotes an integral ecology in which nature and economics and science and religion all must come together to connect what he calls the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And the Pope did try to influence both the UN General Assembly, which is embracing the sustainability goals for the world, and the Paris Climate Conference. On ecology, Trump claims that climate change is a hoax. He claims that he would roll back clean energy programs, would reject the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Agreement. The Republican platform goes along with much of this and seeks to wrest protected lands away from federal control. Clinton is more committed to combating climate change, promoting clean energy, and supporting the Kyoto and Paris Accords. And the Democratic platform strongly encourages and supports a pro-environmental stance. How about human life? Pope Francis says integral ecology must include the defense of human life. Human beings are ends in themselves and not means to an end. The Pope says it's very narrow-minded and selfish to think that we could solve our problems and all live a higher standard of living if all those other people weren't here on the planet with us. If we could reduce the population in the poorer countries, we could all live a higher standard of life. The Pope condemns that as selfish and immoral. Donald Trump claims to be 100% pro-life. He hasn't always been. He says it's a conversion. He also says he advocates imprisonment for women who have abortions, which has never been the stance of the pro-life movement. People of faith do not regard him as a model of evangelical faithfulness. As the author of Faith in the Halls of Power, Michael Lindsay, the evangelist, says, he doesn't even know the language. And 20,000 evangelical leaders have signed on in opposition to Trump as not representing their views. How about Hillary Clinton? Clinton and the Democratic platform embrace the strongest pro-choice stance ever in a political platform. She says she wants abortion to be legal and safe. She used to say legal, safe, and rare. Rare has disappeared from the rhetoric now, and it's just legal and safe. She opposes state and federal restrictions on abortion. She favors the appointment of pro-choice judges. She calls for the repeal of and so does the Democratic platform, call for the repeal of the Hyde Amendment and the Helms Amendment. These two amendments have been an historical compromise for 40 years in the United States, in which people of faith who recognize that abortion is now legal by the Supreme Court decision should not be, that people of faith who oppose it in conscience should not be required to pay for it. The Hyde Amendment provides that public funds will not be used for abortions in the United States. The Helms Amendment, that public funding will not be used for abortions overseas. This would end a 40-year compromise over the public funding of abortion. Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side, last I heard, still supports the Hyde Amendment. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. Advantage Clinton on the environment, Trump nominally on the defense of life, because frankly I'm not sure where he'll land tomorrow. My conclusions. WWFD means what would Francis do, and Francis is both the saint and the Pope. Both Francises could approve some points in both candidates, and also find much that's lacking regarding serving the poor, safeguarding the earth, defending vulnerable life, promoting peace, and civility in public discourse. Here's my conclusion. I don't know if it's large enough to read. Let me read it for you. Given the legitimate anxieties of many Trump supporters about the economy, jobs, and the cultural drift of our society, it's unfortunate that their only voice is that of Donald Trump's xenophobic, racist, sexist, authoritarian, and temperamental instability. His election would be risky on many levels. Likewise, many who support the social justice positions of the Democratic platform are dismayed by the ethical lapses of both Clintons and their enthusiastic commitment to unrestricted abortion. What choice is there? St. Francis counseled his brothers to flee to another country if their freedom to live the gospel was impeded. Flee to another country and live your faith there, he says. Most of us don't have that option. Pope Francis says, in an imperfect world, there are no perfect candidates. Weigh the issues and vote your conscience. admittedly a dreary conclusion to a dispiriting